This talk is about the nature of universal patterns. Sometimes we get to work on the intention we believe is the one where we're stuck. But sometimes our intentions aren't really what the problems are. They're symptoms or manifestations of some deeper universal pattern. Now, all of us know, or most of us know anyway, if we're in our field, all of us have heard of one of these patterns. It's called the Oedipal complex. And what's the Oedipal? Essentially, is a universal pattern. As Freud described it, you could put it into a couple of sentences. You might say something like, I have a forbidden wish, and someone will be able to read my mind in a sense and know about this wish and punish me for it. So if we can heal that pattern, we get to not be traumatized by that, and we get to become like the person who we were afraid of in the first place. But let's suppose we're traumatized around that pattern. Someone might come in and they might say, I have difficulty using my right arm. I have trouble with authority. I have trouble with sexual relationships, and a whole variety of other symptoms. And those things may sound like they have nothing to do with each other, but let's suppose it was about the Oedipal. Then what we might say is all of those symptoms might be a manifestation of this deeper pattern. For example, the person might have a problem with their right arm because they have conflict about pleasuring themselves. They might have trouble with authority because they're afraid that authority will know what they wish and will attack them, and they have to keep themselves small. They may have trouble with sexual and intimate relationships because they feel too incestuous. So all of those seemingly separate problems may all arise out of one moment where there is some kind of conflict, an unresolved conflict around that deep theme. Freud thought that was the one universal theme in all of life. But what we've been doing is mapping, in a sense, the universal patterns that are there in the universe for all of us to know, and there are very many of them. So some of them just have to do with one of our centers, and those patterns are simply when we believe something that isn't true, or we won't let ourselves feel some feeling and we're not at choice about expression, or when we have some kind of boundary problem so that we're not masters of our ship, so to speak, and we don't get to choose what goes in or what comes out, how much. We can't control it. So those are traumas that affect one of the centers, and they're universal patterns. But there are also many thematic universal patterns. Some of those are things like grudges, neglect trauma. In a neglect trauma, you have the experience, I need you like my life depends on it. And I have a reasonable expectation you'll be there, and you're not there with me and for me. In a grudge pattern, the pattern really is about something like my values have been violated, and I act in such a way that guarantees my values will continue to be violated. Or we have wounded patterns we call like wounded healers, and in those patterns they're patterns of betrayal where you betray a sacred trust or break some kind of covenant. Or we have power patterns, and in power patterns it's like if you spoke your truth or you acted on your truth, you would in some way be annihilated or ostracized. We've already described neglect and grudge. Other patterns include death wishes, dead parts, wounded patterns, wonderful patterns, double binds, power patterns, seduction patterns, blocked memories. The list really goes on and on. We've identified probably 15 or 20 such patterns. In, for example, a wonderful pattern, the problem isn't that something is too bad and you can't integrate it. It's that something is too good and you can't integrate it. So instead of being in a place of fear, you're in a place of craving. It's like if you're used to having a life that was gray and suddenly you had a life for a moment that was wonderful because someone treated you really, really well and it never happened again, you might try over and over and over again to search for that one moment where things were so, so good. And it actually kind of plays out like a trauma. So those are kinds of patterns in the material realms. There are also patterns in the non-material realms, and these include things like entities or ghosts or curses or superimpositions or extraterrestrial traumas. The list really also there goes on, and we'll talk more about those in our next video. We have traumas where the problem isn't the trauma itself, but the way we protect ourselves from the trauma. and the choices we make that we forget were choices. So for example, suppose someone was agoraphobic. Well, if it was just a trauma, it may have been that they were stuck in a well and they could never get out. But let's suppose it was not a problem, it was a protection from a problem. So when you were very, very young, you may have run out into a street and you were nearly hit by a bus and you ran back into the house where you felt safe and where it was dark. And then whenever anything happened later in your life, you may not remember this, but in fact what would happen is you would act the same way and you would go back and stay safe in your house, but then you would think it was the problem, but really what was going on, it was protecting you from a worse problem. So let me give you an example of a case of this. We had a young man who came in, and it was because of a major depression. And we found he had no seeming reason for these depressions. He would just seemingly go into them. And in fact, there was a lot of biological depression on both sides of his family, and his mother was about to give him medication for these depressions because they looked biological, but she asked me to do a session with him first. And what we discovered was his depression, in fact, wasn't the problem, but it was a choice he had made to protect himself from an even worse problem. So what I had him do was I had him focus on the depression as though it was a protector and feel it in his body. And what he discovered was when he felt depression in his body, it felt like heavy oatmeal. So I had him become heavy oatmeal, and we asked heavy oatmeal, where are you beginning? And what's happening? And what have you come to share with us? And immediately he remembered a scene from when he was a very young boy. And he had made his father a special present. And his father was having a lot of difficulties at the time, and his father pushed him away and started to go up the stairs. And he kept trying to give his father the present, and his father kept pushing him away until finally his father got to the front door, and he said, "Daddy, take my present, please." And his father pushed him away and went off and drove off in his car. At which point he said to himself, although he had not remembered any of this really, "I don't care." And "I don't care" is really a good foundation for what we call later depression. So he then says, so why did I get depressed the last 2 years when everyone thought it was biological? And I said, well, if we want to find the answer to that, it's easy. Just bring your attention to heavy wet oatmeal and you can find out. So he goes back to what happened this year, and he found something very, very interesting, which was he was now the head of an improv troupe. And he went to his father for his opening, and he said, "Dad, I'm having the opening of our improv troupe. Could you come? I'd love to have you come." And his father said, "I'm so sorry, son, but I can't do that," because his father was remarried and had 2 young children. And he said, "I have to watch them, and I'm so sorry." At which point this young man said, "I don't care, Dad, it's no problem." And the next day he went into a major depression where that had lasted for 2.5 months. So he then says, well, okay, that explains that one, but the year before my father went to my Christmas pageant, so why that year did I have the depression? And I said, well, if you want to know that, just become heavy wet oatmeal again and ask. And he goes back a year earlier and he says, oh, I know what happened. And he saw very vividly and experienced vividly that he had made a special present for his girlfriend. And he could experience himself giving her this present, and she gave a fake smile that he hadn't even realized. It was so subliminal. And then she said, thank you. And he remembers saying to himself, oh, I don't care. All of this wasn't in his memory, and he went into a major depression again for 3 months. So I said to him, here's the situation here. What's really going on is that your depression clearly, even though you didn't know it, was protecting you from something worse, because it was too painful for you when you were that little boy to let yourself experience what it was like for you when your father wouldn't accept your gift and drove off. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take that heavy wet oatmeal, which you asked to come in as a protector, and we're going to give it gratitude, and you're going to thank it and say, thank you so much, but I don't need you anymore. So what he did was he took the heavy wet oatmeal and said, I asked you to come in and I'm grateful, and now I'm going to bring you outside of me. And he brought it outside of him. And meanwhile, he had taken the original scene and he had put it across the room so he could see it, like what happened when he was a young man. And what we had him do was become a pure channel of source energy and channel source energy into the heavy wet oatmeal until it was totally infused with that energy. And then he sent it back as a gift to that much younger him, who then said, "Oh, I can let myself feel the pain of this and it's okay." Then what we did was we said, a much truer you has been hidden or was hiding underneath the protector you called heavy wet oatmeal. So just go into the spaciousness that's now there and find that truer one. And he did that. And he said, "Oh, I see this beautiful young golden-haired boy who's dancing around and is so happy and vibrant." And so what I invited him to do was put his hand very lovingly on his body where that energy was and invite it to come out and touch his hand and expand forward and back and left and right and up and down until he was that vibrant, dancing boy, except that that child gets to keep its childlike wonder and also gets to grow up just like that. And he did that, and he gave me this beatific smile, and he said, "I'm done." So at the end of the session, his mother came in, and he said, "Mom, I feel so much better. I'm starving. Let's go out and get a double cheeseburger." And he hadn't wanted to eat anything like that for 3 months. And what I discovered soon thereafter was all of the symptoms of his depression went away. And he didn't get any depression again for 5 years, at which point he came back, and we found out it was just a different thing that he was protecting himself from, and it went away again also. Now, I'm not saying that all depression is protection, and I'm not saying we can always resolve major depressions in a very quick period of time, but I'm also not saying it's not possible to do.